The wind howled through the valley like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of pine and something darker. Grief so thick it seemed to settle on the land itself. In a weathered ranch house at the edge of Montana's Bitterroot Range, a man sat in the gathering dusk, staring at the empty cradle beside him. The baby's cries had finally subsided into exhausted whimpers, but Thomas Brennan hadn't moved in hours. His hands, calloused from years of working the land, hung useless at his sides. Outside, storm clouds gathered like vultures. Inside, the silence between the infant's gasps felt like drowning. Then through the howling wind came a sound that didn't belong. 3 soft knocks on a door that hadn't opened to a stranger in months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The ranch had died with her. Thomas Brennan stood at the window of the bedroom he could no longer enter, watching the November sun bleed out across the Montana horizon. 6 weeks. It had been 6 weeks since Margaret drew her last rattling breath, her hand growing cold in his, even as he begged her to stay. 6 weeks since the midwife had placed the squalling infant in his arms and said, with eyes full of pity, "She's healthy. Mr. Brennan, your wife made sure of that. Margaret had given everything to bring their daughter into the world, and the world had taken Margaret in return. The baby, Emma, they'd named her after Margaret's mother, wailed from the makeshift bed Thomas had fashioned near the wood stove. The sound cut through him like a blade, sharp and relentless. He'd tried everything, rocking her until his arms ached, walking the floors until his boots wore grooves in the pine, singing songs he barely remembered from his own childhood, his voice cracking on every note. Nothing worked. Nothing soothed her, because what Emma needed, he couldn't give. Thomas moved to the stove and warmed another bottle of goat's milk, his hands shaking as he measured the portions. The local doctor had shown him how: boil the milk, let it cool, test it on his wrist. Simple instructions that felt impossible when your mind was fog and your heart was a stone. Emma rejected it again, turning her tiny face away, her cries escalating into something that sounded like accusation. "I know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I know I'm not her." The ranch stretched around them, 200 acres of grassland and timber that had been in the Brennan family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the original cabin with his own hands. His father had expanded it, added the barn, the corrals, the sturdy fences that still held after 40 years. Thomas had planned to pass it all to his children, to fill the house with the sound of running feet and laughter. Now it was a mausoleum. He managed to get Emma to take a few ounces before exhaustion claimed her. Her small body went limp in his arms, her breathing evening out into the shallow rhythm of infant sleep. Thomas held her longer than necessary, afraid that if he put her down, the quiet would crush him. Through the window, he could see the cattle bunched near the far fence line, dark shapes against the fading light. They needed to be moved to winter pasture. The hay needed to be distributed. The well pump had been making a grinding sound for days. Everything was falling apart, and he couldn't summon the will to care. He finally laid Emma in her cradle, covering her with the quilt Margaret had stitched during her pregnancy, tiny yellow ducks marching across pale blue fabric. His wife's final gift. The thought sent a fresh wave of grief through him, so visceral he had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. The sound of hoofbeats pulled him from the spiral. Thomas moved to the window, one hand instinctively going to the rifle mounted above the door. Visitors were rare this far out, and in his experience, people who showed up unannounced usually brought trouble. But as the rider emerged from the tree line, he recognized the sorrel mare and the stocky figure in the saddle. James Culliver, his nearest neighbor, lived 5 miles east. The man was closing in on 60, with a beard gone mostly gray and eyes that had seen too many hard winters. He dismounted slowly, favoring his left leg, an old injury from a logging accident, and tied his horse to the porch rail. Thomas opened the door before Culliver could knock. "Jim." "Thomas." Culliver removed his hat, revealing a sun-weathered scalp. His gaze flicked past Thomas into the dim interior of the house. "Thought I'd ride out, see how you're managing." Managing fine. It was a lie so transparent neither of them acknowledged it. Culliver shifted his weight. "Heard the baby crying from the road." "That's near half a mile off." Thomas said nothing. What was there to say? That his daughter screamed like she was being murdered every time she woke? That he was terrified every moment she was quiet, convinced she'd stopped breathing? That he fell asleep standing up and woke with his heart hammering, certain Margaret was calling his name? "You eaten today?" Culliver asked. Thomas tried to remember. Had he? There was coffee, he thought. "Maybe some bread? I'm fine, Jim. You look like hell. Appreciate the visit." Culliver didn't take the dismissal. Instead, he pushed past Thomas into the house, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who'd raised 6 children of his own. The pile of soiled cloths in the corner, the unwashed dishes stacked beside the basin, the sour smell of spoiled milk. Christ. "Thomas, I'm handling it. You're drowning." Culliver moved to the stove, checking the fire, adding wood without asking. "Where's your family? Your brother down in Missoula hasn't spoken to me in 3 years. You know that. What about Margaret's people?" "Back east. Her father's letter came last week." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Said they'd pray for us." Culliver muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse. He found a relatively clean pot and began boiling water for coffee. "You can't do this alone, son. Baby needs more than what you can give her. You think I don't know that?" The words came out harsh, edged with desperation. Thomas ran a hand over his face, feeling the weeks of stubble, the hollows beneath his eyes. "Every time I look at her, I see Margaret. Every time she cries, I hear—" He stopped, unable to finish. Culliver's expression softened. "I know, God help me, I know. When Martha passed, I thought I'd follow her into the ground. But you got a living child who needs you present, not just breathing." Emma stirred in her cradle, making small, mewling sounds. Both men froze, waiting. She settled again, one tiny fist working free of the blanket. "There are women in town," Culliver said carefully. "Widows, spinsters. Someone who could help." "No, Thomas, I said no." He couldn't explain it. The irrational certainty that bringing someone else into this house would be a betrayal, that it would mean accepting Margaret was truly gone. "We'll figure it out. Emma and me." Culliver studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but I'm coming back Friday with my wife. Sarah's going to bring supplies, show you some things about the baby. And you're not going to argue. It wasn't a question." Thomas managed a rough nod. After Culliver left, the silence returned, heavier than before. Thomas stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the detritus of his failing attempts at fatherhood, and felt the walls pressing in. The ranch that had been his birthright now felt like a cage. The land he'd loved now seemed vast and empty, a wasteland where hope went to die. He moved to Margaret's rocking chair, the one her father had shipped from Philadelphia as a wedding gift, and lowered himself into it. The wood creaked under his weight, a familiar sound that made his throat tight. How many evenings had he come in from the fields to find her here, knitting or reading, her face lit by lamplight? How many times had he pulled her into his lap, making her laugh with his rough hands on her soft skin? The memories were knives. Emma woke near midnight, her cries shattering the fragile quiet. Thomas prepared another bottle with mechanical precision, his movements automatic from repetition. She drank a little this time, enough to give him hope, then spit up half of it down his shirt. He changed her, his large hands clumsy with the tiny buttons and soft fabric. She screamed through the entire process, her face red, her small body rigid with distress. "Please," he whispered, rocking her against his chest. "Please, baby girl, just sleep, just for a little while." But Emma wouldn't or couldn't be soothed. Her cries echoed through the empty house, bouncing off the walls, filling every corner with her misery and his failure. Thomas walked with her hour after hour, until his legs trembled and his vision blurred, until he couldn't tell any more where his grief ended and hers began, somewhere around 3 in the morning. A new sound pierced through Emma's wailing, the sharp crack of thunder, followed by the drum of rain on the roof. The storm he'd seen building all day had finally broken. Wind rattled the windows and lightning split the sky, throwing stark shadows across the room. Emma's cries reached a fever pitch, and Thomas, standing in the center of the house with his screaming daughter in his arms, finally broke. "I can't do this." The words tore out of him, raw and desperate. "Margaret, I can't. I don't know how." His knees hit the floor. He cradled Emma against his chest, his body curling around hers as if he could shield her from the world, from his inadequacy, from the cruel mathematics that had taken her mother and left her with only him. The rain pounded harder. The wind howled, and beneath it all, so faint he almost missed it, came another sound. 3 knocks on the door, steady, deliberate, impossible. Thomas lifted his head, his breath catching. No one would be out in this storm. No one would ride 5 miles through lightning and rain to knock on his door at 3 in the morning. The knocks came again, patient, waiting. With Emma still crying in his arms, Thomas crossed to the door. His hand hesitated on the latch, some primal part of his brain screaming that nothing good waited on the other side. That you didn't open doors to strangers in the dead of night, in the middle of nowhere, with a storm raging and your world already shattered. But he was too tired to be cautious, too broken to care. He opened the door. A woman stood on his porch, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her face. She wore a simple cotton dress, threadbare and muddied, that clung to her frame. No coat, no hat, no horse that he could see. Lightning flashed behind her, illuminating her face, young, maybe 25, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed too old for her features. But what stopped his breath, what made him stare, was the wetness spreading across the front of her dress. Twin dark circles blooming on the fabric. She looked at Emma, then at him, and spoke in a voice barely above the rain. "Your baby needs to eat." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, rain slanting past him into the house, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The woman swayed slightly, as if the wind might knock her over, but her gaze remained fixed on Emma. The baby's cries had diminished to exhausted hiccups, her small body shuddering with each breath. Thomas started, then stopped. "What did you say to a stranger who appeared out of a storm like an apparition? Where did you come from? Does it matter?" Her voice carried an accent he couldn't quite place. Southern, maybe, but softened, the edges worn smooth. She took a step forward, and he noticed she was barefoot, her feet caked with mud. "Your daughter's hungry. I can help." Every instinct screamed at him to shut the door. "You didn't let strangers into your home, especially not in the middle of the night. Especially not when you were alone with an infant." But Emma whimpered against his chest, a sound of such pure misery that it overrode his caution. He stepped aside. The woman entered without hesitation, water pooling beneath her with each step. She moved past him toward the wood stove, her movements deliberate despite the trembling in her limbs. Up close, Thomas could see she was shivering violently, her lips tinged blue, her skin pale as milk. "You need to get warm," he said, finding his voice. "There are blankets." "After." She turned to face him, extending her arms. "May I?" He understood what she was asking. Every fiber of his being resisted. This woman was a stranger, potentially dangerous, certainly strange. But Emma chose that moment to release a wail that seemed to come from the depths of her tiny soul. And Thomas found himself placing his daughter into the woman's arms. She took Emma with the confidence of someone who'd held many babies. Her hands positioned the infant with practiced ease, supporting the head, cradling the small body against her chest. She moved to the rocking chair, Margaret's chair, and sat, her wet dress leaving dark marks on the wood. "You might want to look away," she said quietly. Thomas turned his back. Heard the rustle of fabric, then a sudden blessed silence. Not complete. He could hear Emma making soft sounds, urgent and needy, but the crying had stopped. He stood facing the wall, his heart hammering, his mind reeling with questions he didn't know how to ask. Minutes passed. The only sounds were the storm outside, the creak of the rocking chair, and the small, satisfied noises Emma made. Thomas risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the woman staring down at his daughter with an expression he couldn't read. Not quite tender, but not cold either. Something distant, like she was looking at Emma but seeing someone else entirely. After what felt like an eternity, the woman spoke. "She's done," Thomas turned fully. The woman had adjusted her dress, though it remained soaked and clinging. Emma lay against her shoulder, eyes closed, her small mouth working in sleep. The transformation was staggering. From the red-faced, rigid infant who'd screamed for hours to this peaceful, sated creature. "How did you—" Thomas stopped, the question too large and too strange. "Thank you." The woman rose carefully, crossing to place Emma in her cradle. She tucked the quilt around the sleeping infant with gentle precision, then stepped back. For the first time, Thomas saw her sway, her hand reaching out to catch herself on the table. He moved without thinking, catching her elbow. "When did you last eat?" "I don't remember." Her skin was ice-cold beneath his hand. Thomas guided her back to the chair, then moved to the stove. The coffee Culliver had made hours ago was still barely warm. He poured a cup and pressed it into her hands, watching as she wrapped her fingers around the tin, seeking warmth more than the drink itself. "There's stew," he said, already moving to the pot he'd left hanging near the fire. It was from 2 days ago, but it was food. He ladled out a bowl, found a mostly clean spoon, and brought it to her. She ate like someone who'd forgotten how hunger worked, taking small, mechanical bites. After several mouthfuls, some color began returning to her cheeks. Thomas found himself studying her properly for the first time. The sharp angles of her face, the hollow beneath her cheekbones, the way her collarbone stood out stark against her skin. This was a woman who'd been hungry for more than just one night. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked up from the bowl. "Does it matter? You just fed my daughter." "I'd like to know who I'm thanking." A pause, long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, Grace Hartley? Thomas Brennan?" He gestured vaguely at the house around them. "This is the Brennan Ranch. Has been for 3 generations. I know." The words sent a chill through him. "You know," I asked in town. "They told me about you. About your wife." Her gaze dropped back to the bowl. "I'm sorry for your loss." The automatic condolence should have felt hollow. Everyone said those words, and none of them changed anything. But something in her voice, a weight of understanding, made them land differently. "You came here on purpose," Thomas said slowly, the pieces falling into place. "You weren't just passing through." Grace set down the bowl, her hands returning to wrap around the coffee cup. "I heard you had a baby, that your wife had died in childbirth. I thought—" She trailed off, her jaw tightening. "I thought maybe I could help by walking 5 miles in a storm. Barefoot? I didn't have shoes." The simple statement hung in the air. Thomas looked at her feet, at the cuts and bruises visible beneath the mud, and felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't some good Samaritan who'd happened by. This was someone as desperate as he was, seeking something he didn't yet understand. "Where did you come from?" he asked again, softer this time. Grace was quiet for a long moment, staring into the coffee as if it held answers. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the rain. "A place I couldn't stay anymore." Thomas recognized the weight of those words, the way they held entire stories that couldn't be told, histories too painful to speak aloud. He'd heard that same tone in his own voice these past weeks when people asked how he was managing. "Are you running from someone?" "No." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "Not anymore." The way she said it made him certain there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Instead, he moved to the corner where Margaret's trunk still sat, unopened since the funeral. His hands hesitated on the lid before lifting it. Inside were her clothes, dresses, shawls, nightgowns. The smell of lavender sachets drifted up, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He pulled out a simple wool dress, dark green, and a shawl. "You can't stay in wet clothes. You'll catch your death." Grace took the garments carefully, as if they might burn her. "These were hers. She won't be needing them." The words came out harsher than he intended. He softened his tone. "Please change. I'll step outside." "In the storm?" "I've been wet before." He went out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind him. The rain had lessened to a steady downpour, the thunder moving east. He stood beneath the overhang, watching water cascade off the roof, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. A strange woman had appeared in the night, fed his starving daughter, and now wore his dead wife's clothes. The rational part of his mind said he should be suspicious, cautious, maybe even afraid. But beneath the shock, all he felt was a desperate, aching relief. Emma had stopped crying. She was fed. She was sleeping. For the first time in 6 weeks, the weight pressing on his chest had eased enough that he could draw a full breath. The door opened behind him. Grace stood in the threshold, transformed by dry clothes and the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Margaret's dress hung loose on her thinner frame, but the color brought out something in her eyes that made her look less like a ghost and more like a woman. "Thank you," she said. "You're the one who deserves thanks. I needed this as much as your daughter did." Her hand moved, unconsciously to her chest, then dropped. "Maybe more." Thomas wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her expression warned him away from the question. Instead, he said, "It's late. You should rest." "The spare room." He stopped, remembering the spare room was full of boxes and broken furniture he'd been meaning to fix for months. "The floor by the fire is fine," Grace said. "I've slept worse places." Another statement that held entire stories. Thomas nodded and went inside, gathering blankets and a pillow that had seen better days. He made a rough pallet near the wood stove, while Grace added wood to keep the fire going through what remained of the night. They worked in silence, the awkwardness of strangers sharing space settling over them. When the makeshift bed was ready, Grace sat down on it, pulling the blankets around her shoulders. "Mr. Brennan," she said as he turned toward his own room. He stopped. Thomas. She adjusted the blankets, not looking at him. "If you need me to leave in the morning, I understand. But if you'd let me stay a few days, until you find someone more suitable, I'd be grateful. Your daughter needs to eat, and she paused, swallowing hard. "I need to feel useful again." Thomas looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully for the first time since Margaret's death. He looked at Grace, this strange woman who'd walked through a storm to offer help he desperately needed. He thought about Culliver's words, "You can't do this alone," and about the long, terrible nights stretching ahead. "Stay," he said, "as long as you need to." Relief flickered across her face, so brief he almost missed it. She nodded once, then lay down, turning to face the fire. Thomas retreated to his bedroom, the room he'd barely entered since Margaret died, where her hairbrush still sat on the dresser and her nightgown hung from a hook. He didn't undress, just lowered himself onto the bed they'd shared and stared at the ceiling. The storm was passing. Through the window, he could see the clouds beginning to break, revealing patches of star-studded sky. The rain had become a whisper, almost peaceful. From the other room came no sound. Emma slept. Grace slept. The house held its breath. Thomas closed his eyes and, for the first time in 6 weeks, didn't dream of Margaret drowning in blood and darkness. Instead, he dreamed of nothing at all, a blank, merciful silence where grief couldn't follow. When he woke to grey dawn light, he lay still for a moment, listening. No crying, no sound at all, except the pop of wood in the stove and the soft creak of floorboards. He rose and moved to the doorway, looking out into the main room. Grace was already awake, sitting in the rocking chair with Emma cradled against her. The baby nursed contentedly, one small hand pressed against Grace's chest. Grace stared out the window at the rain-washed morning, her expression unreadable. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and something passed between them. Not understanding exactly, but recognition. Two people who'd survived their own private storms, now sheltering together in the wreckage. "Good morning," Grace said quietly. Thomas nodded, unable to find words. He moved to the stove, began making coffee, and tried not to think about how natural it felt to have someone else in Margaret's chair, holding his daughter, filling the terrible silence with breath and warmth. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the wet earth gold. A new day beginning, whether they were ready for it or not. The morning unfolded with an unfamiliar rhythm. Thomas moved through his routine, stoking the fire, checking the animals, hauling water from the well, but every action felt different with Grace's presence in the house. He could hear her through the walls, humming softly to Emma. The sound so foreign, after weeks of only crying, that it made his chest tight. By the time he returned from the barn, the sun had burned off the last of the storm clouds. Grace had managed to heat water and was washing dishes in the basin, Emma secured against her chest with a length of cloth she'd fashioned into a sling. The baby's eyes were open, calm, following the movement of Grace's hands. "You didn't have to do that," Thomas said, setting down the milk pails. Grace glanced over her shoulder. "Idle hands make for a restless mind. Besides, you've got enough to manage without worrying about dishes." He wanted to argue, to tell her she was a guest and shouldn't feel obligated to work, but the words stuck in his throat. She wasn't a guest, not really. He didn't know what she was. Helper, stranger, answered prayer. None of the labels seemed to fit. Instead, he said, "I'll strain the milk. You should rest." "I've been resting." She dried the last plate and set it on the shelf. "What needs doing around here?" Thomas looked around the house, at the dust coating every surface, the cobwebs in the corners, the pile of mending that had grown into a mountain. Margaret had kept everything spotless, had taken pride in their home. Now it looked like a place where hope had gone to die. "Everything," he admitted. Grace nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "Then we'll start with what matters most." She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, Emma secured against her. Thomas watched as she opened windows to let in fresh air, swept the floors, reorganized the pantry to see what supplies remained. She worked without asking permission, as if she'd made some internal decision that this was now her responsibility. It should have bothered him. Margaret had been particular about her domain, about how things were organized and maintained. But watching Grace work, he felt only gratitude mixed with guilt. Gratitude that someone was helping. Guilt that he'd let things deteriorate so badly. "There's not much food," Grace said, surveying the pantry. "Flour, some beans, dried meat. When's the last time you went to town?" Thomas tried to remember. "Week before Margaret passed. Maybe longer. You'll need to go soon. Baby needs more than what's here." The thought of leaving Emma, even for the few hours it would take to reach town, sent anxiety spiking through him. What if something happened while he was gone? What if Grace left? What if Emma— "I'll go," he said abruptly. "Today, you'll be all right here." Grace's expression was unreadable. "We'll manage." He wanted to ask more, to establish rules, boundaries, some framework for this strange arrangement. But Emma chose that moment to fuss, and Grace automatically began swaying, bouncing gently, murmuring words too soft to hear. The baby settled immediately, her small hand curling around Grace's finger. Thomas felt something twist inside him, relief and resentment tangled together. Relief that Emma was content. Resentment that she found comfort so easily with a stranger when she'd rejected everything he'd tried. "I'll be back before dark," he said. "Already moving toward the door, Thomas." Grace's voice stopped him. "You need to eat first. And change your shirt. You smell like the barn." He looked down at himself. The same clothes he'd been wearing for days, stained and rumpled. When had he stopped caring? When had basic human dignity become too much effort? Grace had already moved to the stove, still holding Emma, somehow managing to slice bread and cheese one-handed. She set the food on the table along with cold coffee from the pot. "Eat, then go." He obeyed, too tired to argue. The food sat heavy in his stomach, his body having forgotten what satiation felt like. While he ate, Grace disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a clean shirt, one of his own, somehow found and pressed smooth. "Arms up," she said, and he realized she meant to help him change, like he was a child. The intimacy of it should have been awkward, but he was too exhausted to care. She helped him out of the soiled shirt and into the clean one, her movements brisk and impersonal. "You've got cattle to move," she said, buttoning the shirt with her free hand. "I saw them from the window, and your well pump sounds sick. Been meaning to fix it. Add it to the list." She stepped back, surveying him critically. "You'll do. Go on now." Thomas hitched the wagon and made the long ride into town, the morning sun warm on his face. The world looked different after the storm, washed clean, the colors sharper. He passed the Culliver place and saw James working in his yard. The older man raised a hand in greeting, his expression curious. News would spread quickly that Thomas had a woman at his house. Shepherd's Bend was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. Thomas tied his wagon in front of Mortenson's general store and steeled himself for the questions. Inside, the store smelled of coffee and sawdust. Clara Mortenson stood behind the counter, a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She looked up when the bell chimed, her expression shifting from neutral to surprise to something calculating. "Thomas Brennan. Didn't expect to see you today. Need supplies." He pulled out the list Grace had written in surprisingly neat handwriting. "And some things for the baby." Clara took the list, her eyebrows rising as she read. "This is quite a bit. You managing all right out there?" "Well enough. Heard you had company last night. Someone saw lamplight at odd hours." Thomas kept his expression neutral. "In a town this size, someone always saw something. Neighbor stopped by." Clara began gathering items from the shelves. "Mrs. Culliver mentioned they'd be checking on you Friday." "That's still happening?" "Far as I know. She set a tin of milk powder on the counter with more force than necessary. You know, there are proper ways to get help with a child. The church has women who volunteer." "I'm managing, Clara. Are you?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Because people are talking, Thomas. Saying you're not right in the head since Margaret passed. That you're not fit to care for that baby alone." Anger fled hot in his chest. "That's so, and who's saying this?" "Folks who care. Margaret was loved in this town. People want to make sure her daughter's being looked after proper." Thomas placed both hands flat on the counter, leaning in until Clara took a step back. "My daughter is being looked after just fine. And anyone who thinks otherwise can ride out to my place and see for themselves. Otherwise, they can keep their opinions to their damn selves." The store went quiet. 2 other customers had stopped to stare. Clara's face flushed red, but she held her ground. "Just trying to help. Then help by filling that order and keeping your nose out of my business." She did, though her movements were stiff with offense. Thomas paid, loaded the supplies into his wagon, and left without another word. But the damage was done. By nightfall, half the town would know he'd lost his temper. The other half would have embellished the story into something worse. The ride back felt longer than the ride out. Thomas's anger cooled slowly, leaving behind a familiar exhaustion. Clara meant well, most people did. But their help always came wrapped in judgment, in the unspoken message that he was failing, that he wasn't enough. Maybe they were right. When he crested the rise that looked down on his ranch, he saw smoke rising from the chimney in a steady, healthy stream. Someone had fixed the damper he'd been meaning to repair for weeks. As he drew closer, he noticed other changes. The porch had been swept. The gate that had been hanging crooked now stood straight. Inside, the house smelled of bread baking. Grace stood at the stove, Emma sleeping in a basket nearby. She'd pinned her hair back, revealing the long line of her neck, and rolled up her sleeves to her elbows. For a moment, Thomas just stood in the doorway, caught by the domesticity of the scene. This was how it should have been. Margaret at the stove, Emma sleeping peacefully, him returning from town. The life they'd planned, the life he'd lost. Grace turned, sensing his presence. "You're back. Good. Help me move this pot. It's heavier than I expected." The moment broke. This wasn't Margaret, and pretending otherwise would be a cruelty to everyone involved. He moved to help, their hands briefly touching on the pot handle before Grace pulled away. "How was town?" she asked. "Fine. Got what we needed. Just fine." He set the pot on the table and began unloading the wagon. "People talk." "Let them." Grace was quiet for a moment, then said, "They're talking about me." It wasn't a question. Thomas glanced at her and saw no fear in her expression, just resignation. "Probably. You want me to leave?" "No." The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended. He softened his tone. "No, you're helping. That's what matters." She nodded slowly, but something in her expression had closed off. Thomas wanted to ask what she was thinking, but Emma woke before he could, her small cries immediately bringing Grace to her side. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas worked on the well pump, while Grace tended to Emma and prepared supper. They moved around each other like dancers learning new steps, sometimes graceful, sometimes awkward, always careful not to collide. When the sun began its descent, Thomas came inside to find the table set for two. Grace had made a simple meal: beans, bread, dried beef, rehydrated in broth. It was more food than Thomas had eaten at once in weeks. They sat across from each other, Emma sleeping in her basket between them, and ate in silence. Finally, Grace spoke. "You asked me last night where I came from." Thomas looked up, surprised. He'd assumed she would never answer that question. "I had a baby," she continued, her voice steady but her hands clenching her fork too tight. "A son. He was born last spring, healthy and strong. I had plenty of milk." "Too much," the midwife said. "I could have fed twins." She paused, staring at her plate. Thomas waited, sensing this was a story that couldn't be rushed. His father didn't want him, didn't want me. I was just someone he used when he was lonely. Her jaw tightened. "When I told him I was pregnant, he gave me money and told me to take care of it. When I wouldn't, he made it clear I wasn't welcome in his house anymore." "His house?" "I worked there. Cook and maid." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I know what you're thinking. That I should have known better. That I was foolish. I wasn't thinking that. Everyone else did." She set down her fork. "I had the baby alone. A woman in town helped me, let me stay in her back room. I thought I could manage. Find work, keep my son safe. But 3 weeks ago he got a fever. I tried everything. Kept him cool, got medicine from the doctor. Nothing worked." Her voice cracked on the last word. Thomas felt his chest constrict, knowing where this story was going. "He died in my arms, just stopped breathing. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't." She wrapped her arms around herself. "The milk didn't stop, though. My body didn't understand that he was gone. It just kept making food for a baby who'd never eat again." Thomas found his voice. "Grace, I couldn't stay in that town. Everywhere I looked, I saw him, heard him, and my body kept reminding me every day that I'd failed." She stood abruptly, moving to the window. "I heard about you 2 towns over. Man whose wife had died, left with a baby he couldn't feed. And I thought, maybe I could help. Maybe all this pain could serve some purpose." The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief. Thomas rose and crossed to stand beside her, not touching, just present. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "So am I." She wiped at her eyes impatiently. "I know this is strange. I know I'm a stranger. But when I heard your baby crying last night, I had to try." Thomas looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully, her small chest rising and falling. "You saved her life. You know that, don't you?" Grace shook her head. "I just gave her what she needed, what I needed to give." They stood together in the fading light, 2 people bound by loss and necessity, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. Outside, the cattle lowed in the distance. Inside, Emma slept on, unaware of the quiet miracle keeping her alive. "Thank you," Thomas said finally, "for telling me." "For staying." Grace nodded but said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth was laid bare between them now. Two broken people trying to piece together something that resembled life. One day at a time. As darkness fell, they settled into the evening routine they'd somehow established in less than 24 hours. Grace tended to Emma, while Thomas secured the house for the night. They moved with the careful courtesy of strangers who'd seen each other's wounds and chosen not to look away. When Emma was settled, and Grace had retreated to her pallet by the fire, Thomas lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but it was a different quiet now. Not the suffocating silence of death, but the peaceful stillness of rest. For the first time since Margaret died, Thomas closed his eyes and thought maybe, just maybe, they'd all survived this after all. Friday arrived with crisp autumn air and the certainty of judgment. Thomas had been dreading this day since Monday, when James Culliver had promised to return with his wife. Now, as he worked in the barn mucking out stalls, he kept glancing toward the road, tension coiling tighter in his shoulders with each passing hour. Grace seemed to sense his unease. She'd risen before dawn, cleaned the house more thoroughly than necessary, and changed Emma into the nicest gown they had, a white cotton thing with tiny embroidered flowers that Margaret had made during her pregnancy. Grace herself wore Margaret's blue Sunday dress, her hair braided and pinned in a style that made her look older, more respectable. You don't have to impress them, Thomas said, watching her adjust the dress for the third time. Yes, I do. She didn't look at him, focusing instead on Emma. They're your friends. They care about you. They deserve to see that things are proper here, proper. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Nothing about their situation was proper. A widower and a strange woman living under the same roof, bound together by grief and necessity. The town would see scandal, no matter how innocent the reality. The sound of wagon wheels on gravel announced the Cullivers' arrival. Thomas set down his pitchfork and walked toward the house, wiping his hands on his pants. Through the window, he saw Grace take a deep breath, squaring her shoulders like a soldier preparing for battle. James Culliver climbed down from the wagon first, then helped his wife Sarah descend. Sarah Culliver was a formidable woman in her late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She'd raised 6 children, buried 2, and had opinions on everything from politics to pie crust. Her gaze swept over the property, noting every detail. Before settling on Thomas, she said, her voice carrying the authority of a woman used to being obeyed. Mrs. Culliver, James. Thomas nodded to each of them. Thank you for coming. Wouldn't be anywhere else. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. Going to invite us in, or are we conducting business in the yard? Thomas led them inside, acutely aware of their scrutiny. The house was cleaner than it had been in months, but would they notice? Or would they only see what was missing? Margaret's touch, her warmth, the life she'd breathed into these walls. Grace stood near the window, Emma in her arms. She'd positioned herself carefully, Thomas realized, in good light, so they could see her clearly, but at a respectful distance. She'd thought this through. Mr. and Mrs. Culliver, Grace said, her voice steady. Thank you for caring about this family. It speaks well of you. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly at being thanked before she could speak. She crossed the room in 3 long strides, her gaze fixed on Emma. Let me see the child. Grace handed Emma over without hesitation. Sarah took the baby with the confidence of experience, her hands checking automatically, the weight, the skin tone, the alertness in Emma's eyes. Emma, for her part, regarded Sarah with solemn curiosity but didn't cry. She's healthy, Sarah said, surprise coloring her words. Well-fed, content. She looked up at Grace. You've been caring for her? Yes, ma'am. How long? 4 days, Sarah's gaze sharpened. And before that? Before that, I was struggling, Thomas interjected. Emma wasn't taking the goat's milk. She cried constantly. I didn't know what to do. James moved to stand beside his wife, looking down at Emma with the fondness of a man who'd held many babies. She looks good now, though. Whatever you're doing is working. The unspoken question hung in the air. What exactly are you doing? Grace met Sarah's gaze directly. I'm nursing her, Mrs. Culliver. I had a baby of my own who passed. My milk hadn't dried up. When I heard Mr. Brennan needed help, I came. The bluntness of it seemed to catch Sarah off guard. She studied Grace for a long moment, her expression unreadable. That's a generous gift. It's a necessary one. Where are you from, girl? South originally, Georgia. I've been moving north for the past year. Family? None living, ma'am. Sarah handed Emma back to Grace, her movements deliberate. And the father of your child? Not in the picture. Grace's voice remained steady, but Thomas saw her fingers tighten slightly on Emma. Never was. The silence that followed was heavy with judgment and calculation. Thomas wanted to defend Grace, to tell the Cullivers that her past didn't matter, only what she was doing now. But he knew Sarah Culliver well enough to understand that speaking too forcefully would only confirm her suspicions. Finally, Sarah turned to Thomas. Walk with me. James, you stay here with the women. It wasn't a request. Thomas followed Sarah outside, his stomach knotting. They walked toward the pasture, where his cattle grazed in the afternoon sun. Sarah said nothing until they were well out of earshot of the house. What are you doing, Thomas? I'm keeping my daughter alive by bringing a strange woman into your home. A woman with no references, no family, no history. A woman who saved Emma's life. Sarah stopped, turning to face him. And what happens when the milk dries up? When the baby doesn't need her anymore? She just leaves? Goes back to wherever she came from? I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead. Well, you better start thinking. Sarah's voice was sharp but not unkind. People are already talking, Thomas. You know how this town is. A widow and a single woman living together. No chaperone, no propriety. Emma is our chaperone. A baby isn't propriety, it's an excuse for scandal. Sarah sighed, her expression softening slightly. I understand you're in a difficult position. I do, but there are other ways to handle this. We could find a wet nurse who comes during the day, or Emma could stay with us for a while. No! The word came out harder than he intended. Emma stays with me. This is her home. Then marry the girl. Thomas stared at her, certain he'd misheard. What? Marry her, Sarah repeated calmly. Make it legitimate. It would solve everything. The baby gets cared for, the girl gets security and respectability, and you get help managing this place. People might still gossip, but they couldn't say it was improper. I barely know her. Margaret's only been gone 6 weeks. You think I don't know that? Sarah's voice gentled. You think I don't see the grief still eating at you? But Margaret is gone, Thomas. And you have a living daughter who needs stability. This girl, Grace, she seems capable, honest, despite her circumstances. And she's already caring for Emma like her own. Thomas looked back at the house, where he could see movement through the window. I can't. It wouldn't be fair to anyone. Fair? Sarah shook her head. Life isn't fair, Thomas Brennan. If it were, Margaret would be alive. Your daughter would have her mother, and that girl in there would be raising her own child. But this is what we've got. Now we make the best of it. They walked back in silence. Inside, James had somehow coaxed Grace into sitting at the table, and the two were talking quietly while Emma dozed in Grace's arms. James looked up as they entered, his expression carefully neutral. Sarah moved to the stove, taking charge with the ease of long practice. James helped Thomas with the evening chores. I'll stay here with Grace and get supper started. It was a dismissal. Thomas exchanged a glance with James, who shrugged slightly. His wife had spoken. The two men retreated outside, leaving the women alone. For the next hour, Thomas and James worked in companionable silence, checking the cattle, repairing a section of fence that had come loose in the storm. It was the kind of work Thomas had been neglecting, too consumed by grief and exhaustion to maintain his property properly. "Your range looks good," James said finally. "Better than I expected given everything. Grace has been helping. More than I probably deserve." James hammered a post into place before responding. "She seems like a good woman. Quiet but strong. Sarah will see that, and if she doesn't, then we'll deal with it." James straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "But between you and me, I think Sarah's already made up her mind." They returned to the house as the sun began setting. The smell of cooking meat and bread greeted them. Sarah had somehow transformed their meager supplies into a proper meal. Grace sat at the table feeding Emma with a cloth draped modestly over her shoulder. Sarah moved between the stove and the table with proprietary ease, as if she'd cooked in this kitchen 100 times. They ate together, the 4 adults passing dishes and making small talk about weather and cattle prices. Emma slept in her basket, content and full. It should have been awkward, this forced domesticity with near strangers, but somehow it worked. After supper, while James and Thomas cleaned up, Sarah pulled Grace aside. Thomas couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw Sarah's serious expression, the way Grace's back straightened, how she nodded occasionally. When they finished, Sarah patted Grace's arm, not quite approval but not condemnation either. As the Cullivers prepared to leave, Sarah took Thomas aside one more time. "I'll tell people what I saw here. A clean house, a healthy baby, and a woman doing her Christian duty, helping a neighbor in need. That should quiet most of the gossip. Thank you. Don't thank me yet." Her gaze was piercing. "I also told Grace she's welcome at church Sunday. If she doesn't come, people will assume she's hiding something. If she does, they'll see she's respectable. Your choice how to handle that." After they left, Thomas and Grace stood on the porch, watching the wagon disappear into dusk. Emma was awake again, making small cooing sounds. "Mrs. Culliver is formidable," Grace said finally. "That's one word for it. She told me I should stay. That Emma needs consistency." Grace's voice was careful, neutral. "She also suggested that you should consider making arrangements for the long term." Thomas felt heat rise in his face. "She had no right. She's trying to protect you." "And Emma, I understand that." Grace turned to face him. "Thomas, I need you to know something. I'm not here to trap you into anything. I'm not looking for a husband or security or whatever the town thinks. I'm here because a baby needed help and I could give it. When that changes, I'll go. And if I don't want you to go..." The words were out before he could stop them. Grace's eyes widened slightly, then her expression shuttered. "We should go inside," she said quietly. "It's getting cold." That night, Thomas lay awake long after the house fell silent. Through the wall he could hear Grace's soft breathing, Emma's occasional stirring. He thought about Sarah's words, "marry the girl," and felt something twist in his chest. It was too soon, too fast, too much like betraying Margaret's memory. But another part of him, the practical part that had learned survival on this harsh land, whispered that Sarah was right. Emma needed stability. Grace needed protection from gossip and worse. And he needed help. Needed another person in this house before the loneliness consumed him completely. He thought about Grace's story, her son, her loss, the way she'd walked through a storm to help a stranger. She'd suffered as much as he had, maybe more. She hadn't chosen this situation any more than he had, but they were in it together now, whether they'd planned it or not. As sleep finally claimed him, Thomas made a decision. He didn't know if it was right or wrong, wisdom or madness. But in the morning he would talk to Grace, really talk, about the future, about expectations, about what they were building here in the ruins of their separate griefs. Whatever came next, they would face it deliberately. No more simply surviving day to day. It was time to decide what kind of life they were going to build. Together or apart, the choice would be theirs. But the consequences would belong to them both. Sunday morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of day where breath turned to fog and frost painted the windows white. Thomas woke earlier than usual, his stomach churning with anxiety he couldn't quite name. Today, they would go to church, the first time he'd set foot in the building since Margaret's funeral. He found Grace already awake, sitting in the rocking chair with Emma. She wore Margaret's grey dress, the most modest one they had, with a white collar she'd somehow fashioned from an old pillowcase. Her hair was pulled back severely, not a strand out of place. She looked like a woman preparing for battle. "You don't have to do this," Thomas said. Grace looked up, her expression calm but determined. "Yes, I do. Mrs. Culliver was right. If I don't go, people will assume I'm ashamed. That there's something to hide. And if they're cruel, then they're cruel. I've survived worse than gossip," Thomas wanted to argue, to tell her they could stay home, let the town think what it wanted. But he knew that path led nowhere good. In a place like Shepherd's Bend, absence was guilt. If they wanted any kind of peace, they had to face the congregation head-on. The ride to town took an hour, the wagon rattling over rutted roads still muddy from last week's storm. Emma slept in a basket between them, wrapped in blankets against the chill. Grace sat straight-backed and silent, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. As they approached the white clapboard church, Thomas saw that they'd timed it poorly. Nearly everyone had already arrived. Wagons and horses filled the yard, and clusters of people stood talking on the steps. The conversations died as Thomas pulled up, every head turning to watch. He set the brake and climbed down, then reached up to help Grace descend. She took his hand, her fingers ice-cold despite her gloves, and stepped down with careful dignity. Thomas retrieved Emma's basket, and together they walked toward the church entrance. The crowd parted like water around a stone. Thomas felt the weight of their stares, heard the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Henderson, the butcher's wife. Clara Mortensen stood near the door, her eyes narrowing as she took in Grace's appearance. The borrowed dress, the too careful hair, the way she held herself like glass about to shatter. Thomas. Pastor William Gaines appeared at the top of the steps, his round face flushed from the cold. He was a good man, Thomas had always thought, genuinely kind, rather than performatively pious. "Good to see you. It's been too long, Pastor." Thomas nodded, then gestured to Grace. "This is Grace Hartley. She's been helping with Emma." The pastor's eyes were sharp but not unkind. He extended his hand to Grace. "Miss Hartley, welcome to our congregation." "Thank you, Pastor." Grace shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate the hospitality." If Gaines noticed the carefully neutral phrasing, hospitality, not welcome, he didn't show it. "Please come in. Service is about to start." Inside, the church smelled of wood polish and old hymn books. The Cullivers had saved seats for them in the middle section, not so far forward as to seem presumptuous, not so far back as to suggest shame. Sarah nodded approvingly as they slid into the pew, Emma's basket resting at Grace's feet. The service began with a hymn. Thomas's voice was rusty from disuse, but he sang anyway, the familiar words providing a strange comfort. Beside him, Grace sang softly, her voice clear and surprisingly lovely. It was the first time he'd heard her sing anything but lullabies to Emma. Pastor Gaines's sermon was about the Good Samaritan. Pointed, Thomas thought, but not unsubtly so. He spoke of helping strangers, of mercy over judgment, of seeing Christ in the faces of those society overlooked. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded along, missing entirely that the message was directed at them. Halfway through the sermon, Emma woke and began to fuss. Grace immediately lifted her from the basket, but the baby's cries escalated quickly. Thomas saw Grace's face flush as heads turned. She rose to leave, but the pastor's voice stopped her. "Please don't go on our account," Gaines said kindly. "The baby's cry is the sound of life. God welcomes it." Grace hesitated, then sat back down. She positioned Emma discreetly, draping a shawl over her shoulder, and the crying stopped almost instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, not peaceful but shocked. Thomas felt rage building in his chest at the judgment on every face. Then Sarah Culliver stood up. She walked across the aisle to their pew and sat down beside Grace, placing a hand on her arm in clear solidarity. The message was unmistakable. Sarah Culliver, pillar of the community, approved. The rest of the service passed in a blur. When it ended, Thomas braced himself for the gauntlet they'd have to run outside. People filed out slowly, many casting glances their way. As Thomas and Grace reached the door, a woman stepped into their path, Judith Brennan. Thomas's sister-in-law, his late brother's widow. She lived in town now, ran a boarding house, and had opinions on everything. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes hard. Thomas. A word, Judith. Privately. Thomas looked at Grace, who nodded slightly and moved away with Emma, joining the Cullivers near their wagon. He followed Judith to the side of the church, away from curious ears. What in God's name are you doing? Judith hissed. I'm caring for my daughter by shacking up with some vagrant. Have you lost your mind? Grace is not a vagrant. She's helping. She's a scandal waiting to explode. Judith's voice was low and vicious. Do you have any idea what people are saying? That you replaced Margaret before she was cold in the ground. That this woman is some kind of harlot who trapped you. That's enough. Thomas's voice came out hard and flat. You don't know anything about Grace or what she's done for Emma. For me, I know she showed up out of nowhere with no history and moved into your house. I know Margaret would be ashamed. Don't. The word cracked like a whip. Don't you dare speak for Margaret. You never liked her when she was alive. Don't pretend you're defending her memory now. Judith's face went white with fury. I'm trying to protect you, to protect Emma. That child deserves better than being raised by a stranger with questionable morals. Emma is being raised by her father. Grace is helping. That's all, for now. Judith leaned closer. But what happens when she wants something in return? When she decides she's earned a claim on your property, your name? Women like that always have an angle. Thomas felt something inside him snap. Women like what, Judith? Women who help people in need. Women who show kindness without expecting payment. Maybe if more people were like Grace, this town wouldn't be so goddamn miserable. He turned and walked away before she could respond, his hands shaking with suppressed anger. Grace stood by the wagon, Emma in her arms, talking quietly with Sarah Culliver. She looked up as he approached, reading his face instantly. We should go, she said softly. Wait. Pastor Gaines hurried over, slightly out of breath. Thomas, Miss Hartley, please. I wanted to say, that is, I hope you'll both come back next week. You're always welcome here. Thomas wanted to refuse, to tell him to hell with his church and the people in it. But Grace spoke first. Thank you, Pastor. We'll consider it. The ride home was silent. Emma slept, oblivious to the tension radiating from both adults. Thomas's jaw ached from clenching it, and he could feel Grace's eyes on him occasionally, though she said nothing. Finally, as the ranch came into view, Grace broke the silence. Your sister-in-law, Judith? She means well in her way. No, she doesn't. Grace's voice was matter-of-fact, not bitter. She means to protect her idea of propriety. It's not the same thing. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house, but made no move to get down. I'm sorry. For what she said. For what they're all thinking. Why are you apologizing? You haven't done anything wrong, haven't I? He turned to face her. I brought you into a situation where you're being judged and whispered about. Where people assume the worst because that's easier than believing someone might just be kind. Grace shifted Emma in her arms. Thomas, I knew what I was walking into. I'm not naive. A single woman living with a widower, of course people will talk. But I also know the alternative was watching a baby starve and a good man break himself trying to prevent it. So yes, I'll endure the gossip and the judgment because Emma is worth it. And what about you? What about what you're worth? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked down at Emma, her expression unreadable. I lost my worth when I let myself believe a man's promises, when I had a baby out of wedlock, when I couldn't keep him alive. Her voice remained steady, clinical. Whatever judgment this town passes on me, I've already passed worse on myself. Thomas felt his chest tighten. Grace, can we go inside? It's cold, and Emma needs to eat. She climbed down before he could help her, carrying Emma into the house with her back straight and her head high. Thomas sat in the wagon for a long moment, staring at the closed door, before finally following. Inside, Grace had already started a fire and was settling into the rocking chair with Emma. Thomas stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, feeling like an intruder in his own house. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. I've been thinking, Thomas said finally, about what Mrs. Culliver suggested. Grace's hands stilled on Emma's blanket. About? About making this arrangement official, legal. He forced himself to continue. People are going to talk no matter what we do. But if we were married, at least Emma would be protected. You would be protected. It would give us both security. Grace was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Is this a proposal, Thomas? Or a business arrangement? I don't know. The honesty felt like stripping himself bare. I don't know what this is. I know that Emma needs you. I know that you need a place to be safe. I know that I can't keep doing this alone, and I don't want to. He moved closer, kneeling so he could see her face. I'm not offering you love. I don't know if I have that to give anymore. But I'm offering you respect, partnership, and a home. Is that enough? Grace looked down at Emma, who had finished nursing and was now sleeping against her chest. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. What about Margaret? Margaret is gone. The words hurt to say, but they were true. And I think she'd understand. She'd want Emma cared for. She'd want me to have help. She wouldn't want either of us to be alone in our grief. And when people say I trapped you, when they say I'm a gold digger or worse, let them say it. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's what matters. Grace was quiet again, her hand moving in slow circles on Emma's back. When she looked up, her face was composed, but her eyes held something raw and hopeful. I need you to understand something. If I say yes, it's not because I'm desperate or scheming. It's because I believe we could build something good here, something honest. Not love, maybe not at first, but partnership, mutual respect, a real family for Emma. I understand, and I need time to think about it properly, to make sure we're both making this choice for the right reasons. Thomas nodded, relief and disappointment warring in his chest. Take all the time you need. But as he rose and turned away, Grace's voice stopped him. Thomas, ask me again. Not today, but soon. Ask me properly, not like a business transaction. Even if love isn't part of it yet, dignity should be. He looked back at her, this woman who'd walked into his life during a storm and somehow become essential. I will, I promise. That evening, they moved around each other with a new awareness. Every glance held weight, every casual touch seemed significant. Emma, oblivious to the shift, slept and ate and made her small baby noises, the center around which their two orbits revolved. As darkness fell and Grace settled onto her pallet by the fire, Thomas stood at his bedroom door. Grace? Yes? Thank you. For today. For staying through all that. She turned to look at him, her face half shadowed by firelight. Where else would I go? It wasn't an answer exactly, but it was enough. Thomas closed his door and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Somewhere in the night, a decision was crystallizing, taking shape like ice, forming on water. He didn't know if it was right or wise, or what Margaret would truly think, but he knew it was necessary. And sometimes that had to be enough. 3 days passed before Thomas found his courage. 3 days of working alongside Grace in careful silence, of watching her tend to Emma with a tenderness that made his chest ache, of lying awake at night, rehearsing words that never sounded right. He needed to do this properly. Grace had asked for dignity, and she deserved nothing less. On Wednesday afternoon, while Grace was occupied with laundry and Emma napped in her basket, Thomas rode into town. He had a specific destination in mind, the home of Samuel Fletcher, the town's jeweler and watchmaker. Fletcher was an old man now, nearly 70, who'd been making and repairing fine things since before Thomas was born. The shop smelled of metal and oil, of precision and craft. Fletcher looked up from his workbench, his magnifying glass making one eye grotesquely large. Thomas Brennan. "Don't often see you in here, Mr. Fletcher." Thomas removed his hat. "I need a ring." The old man set down his tools, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding. "I see, something simple or something special." "Something honest," Thomas said, surprising himself with the answer. "Nothing pretending to be what it's not." Fletcher nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. He moved to a cabinet and withdrew a small wooden box. Inside lay several rings, some elaborate, some plain, all clearly crafted with care. "This one," Fletcher said, lifting a simple silver band. "Made it last year from ore I got from the mountains. No gemstone, no fancy engraving. Just solid silver meant to last. Honest work for honest purpose." Thomas took the ring, feeling its weight. It was beautiful in its simplicity, smooth and cool, catching the light without demanding attention. "How much?" Fletcher named a price that was more than fair, almost suspiciously so. When Thomas counted out the money, the old man waved some of it away. "Consider it a wedding gift. If you're marrying who I think you're marrying, you'll need luck more than I need money. People talk to you. People talk to everyone. And for what it's worth?" Fletcher fixed him with a steady gaze. "I think you're doing right. Life's too short to spend it alone out of fear of what fools might say." Thomas pocketed the ring and left before emotion could get the better of him. He stopped at the general store next, enduring Clara Mortenson's tight-lipped disapproval as he purchased flour, sugar, and a few other supplies Grace had mentioned they needed. He also bought something he hadn't planned on, a bolt of deep blue fabric that reminded him of the Montana sky just before dawn. "For your housekeeper?" Clara asked, her tone making the word an insult. "For my family," Thomas said firmly, and had the satisfaction of seeing her purse her lips in offense. The ride home took longer than usual. Thomas found himself nervous, second-guessing everything. What if Grace said no? What if she'd changed her mind during these 3 days? What if she realized she could do better than a grieving widower with a failing ranch and a mountain of pain? But when he crested the rise and saw the ranch below, smoke rising from the chimney and laundry flapping on the line Grace had strung between 2 posts, something settled in his chest. This was home, and Grace had made it feel that way again. He found her in the garden, or what was left of it. She'd cleared away the dead plants from summer and was turning soil, preparing it for spring. Emma lay on a blanket nearby, watching the clouds drift overhead with the serious concentration only babies could manage. Grace looked up as he approached, pushing hair from her face and leaving a streak of dirt on her cheek. "You're back early. Had errands." He dismounted, suddenly uncertain how to begin. "Grace, could we talk? Inside?" Something in his tone made her straighten. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked up Emma, following him into the house. Thomas set the supplies on the table, his heart hammering so hard he was certain she could hear it. "I got you something," he said, pulling out the bolt of fabric. "Thought you might like it. For a new dress if you want." Grace's eyes widened. She reached out to touch the fabric, her fingers gentle. "Thomas, this is beautiful." "But you didn't have to." "I wanted to." He took a breath. "Grace, I've been thinking about what you said, about asking properly, about dignity and respect." He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the ring. "I'm not good with words. Never have been. But I want to try to do this right." He knelt down, one knee on the floor, and Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Emma made a small sound, as if she knew something important was happening. "Grace Hartley," Thomas began, his voice rough but steady, "I can't promise you a love story. I can't promise that my grief won't sometimes make me difficult to live with, or that I'll always know the right thing to say. But I can promise you respect, partnership, a home where you'll never have to be afraid or ashamed. I can promise that I'll honor you, provide for you, and stand beside you against whatever this town or this world throws at us." He held up the ring. "I'm asking you to be my wife, not because it's convenient or practical, though it is both those things. I'm asking because in these past weeks you've shown me that surviving isn't the same as living. And I think maybe together we could do more than just survive." Tears streamed down Grace's face. She set Emma in her basket and knelt down in front of Thomas, taking his hands in hers. "Thomas Brennan, you beautiful, stubborn man. Do you know what you're offering me? A life, I hope. More than that. You're offering me redemption. A chance to be more than my mistakes. To be a mother to Emma, even if I can't be her mother by blood. To build something real and good from the ashes of what we've both lost." She smiled through her tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if Fletcher had known somehow. Then awkwardly, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead. Not a romantic kiss, but something equally important. A promise. A beginning. They stayed there for a moment, kneeling on the floor with Emma between them, 3 broken pieces fitting together into something that might, with time and care, become whole. "When?" Grace asked finally. "Soon as we can arrange it. Pastor Gaines will do it, I think. And I want the Cullivers there. They've earned that. Your sister-in-law will have words. Let her." Thomas stood, helping Grace to her feet. "We're not doing this for her approval. We're doing it because it's right." That evening, they sat together at the table and made plans. The wedding would be simple. Just the pastor, the Cullivers as witnesses, and Emma. No fanfare, no performance. Just 2 people making a commitment before God, and the few people who mattered. "What about after?" Grace asked. Sleeping arrangements." Thomas felt heat rise in his face. "We'll take it slow. I'm not expecting, that is, I wouldn't presume." He cleared his throat. "You can keep the room by the fire as long as you want it. Or we can figure out something else. Whatever makes you comfortable." Grace's expression softened. "You're a good man, Thomas. I'm trying to be." Over the next few days, the ranch hummed with quiet preparation. Grace worked on her wedding dress, transforming the blue fabric into something simple but beautiful. Thomas cleaned the house more thoroughly than he had in months, repaired the bedroom furniture, and even rode out to pick wildflowers that still bloomed in the sheltered valleys. On Saturday, he went to town one more time to speak with Pastor Gaines. The pastor agreed immediately to perform the ceremony the following afternoon, asking no awkward questions, offering only genuine congratulations. "You're doing a brave thing," Gaines said. "Not everyone could choose life after such loss. Not sure it's brave. Might just be practical. Same thing sometimes." Thomas stopped at the Cullivers' place on the way home. Sarah answered the door, her eyebrows rising when she saw him. "Thomas. Something wrong?" "No, ma'am. Actually, something's right. Grace and I are getting married tomorrow, and we'd be honored if you and James would stand witness." Sarah's face broke into a genuine smile, the first Thomas had seen from her. "Well, it's about time you came to your senses. Of course we'll be there. What time?" 2 o'clock at the church. We'll be there at 1:30. She paused, then added, "You're doing right by that girl, Thomas. And by Emma. Margaret would approve, I think." The words, which might have angered him a week ago, now brought only peace. "I hope so." Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. Thomas woke before sunrise and spent an hour just sitting on the porch, watching the sky lighten from black to grey to gold. This was the last morning he'd wake as a single man. Tomorrow he'd have a wife again, not Margaret, never Margaret, but someone who'd chosen to build a life with him despite everything. Inside, he could hear Grace moving around, her voice soft as she talked to Emma. The sound was becoming familiar. Comfortable home. He washed and shaved carefully, put on his one good suit, the same one he'd worn to Margaret's funeral. For a moment, the memory threatened to overwhelm him. But then he heard Emma laugh, that burbling baby sound of pure joy, and the present rushed back. Grace emerged from behind the sheet she'd hung for privacy, and Thomas's breath caught. The blue dress fit her perfectly, the color bringing out the warmth in her skin and the depths in her eyes. She'd pinned her hair up, leaving a few soft curls to frame her face. She looked beautiful, but more than that, she looked happy, hopeful. "Will I do?" she asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "You're perfect." They made the journey to town in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet now. Emma dozed in her basket, and occasionally Thomas would glance at Grace, finding her looking back. Each time they'd smile, small private smiles that felt like secrets. The Cullivers were waiting at the church when they arrived. Sarah had brought wildflowers and had already arranged them on the altar. James stood by with his best Sunday hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable but pleased. Pastor Gaines met them at the door. "Ready?" Thomas looked at Grace, who nodded. Together, they walked down the aisle. No music, no audience, just footsteps echoing in the empty church. Emma woke and made small sounds but didn't cry. The ceremony was brief. Pastor Gaines spoke of commitment and partnership, of choosing love even in the face of loss, of building futures on the foundation of faith. When he asked if they each took the other as spouse, Thomas's voice rang clear. "I do." Grace's answer was quieter, but no less certain. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by God and the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride." Thomas leaned in slowly, giving Grace time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was chaste and brief, but felt like a promise being sealed. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. Sarah Culliver wiped her eyes. "Congratulations to you both. Now let's get to the real celebration. I've got a ham in the wagon." They had a small feast at the ranch. Ham, bread, preserved vegetables, and a cake Sarah had somehow managed to bake that morning. They ate and talked and laughed, and for a few hours the weight of grief lifted enough to let in light. As evening fell and the Cullivers prepared to leave, Sarah pulled Grace aside. Thomas watched them talk, saw Sarah press something into Grace's hand, saw Grace's eyes well with tears as she hugged the older woman. After they left, Grace showed him what Sarah had given her, a cameo brooch that had belonged to Sarah's mother. "She said every bride needs something to pass down," Grace whispered. That night, after Emma was settled and the house was quiet, Thomas and Grace stood awkwardly in the main room. "So," Thomas said. "So," Grace echoed. "You don't have to. The room by the fire is still yours if you want it." Grace looked at the pallet, then at Thomas, then at the bedroom door. "I think," she said slowly, "that married people should probably share a room, even if we're taking things slow." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "All right. I'll stay on my side." They prepared for bed in shy silence, changing in separate spaces, moving around each other with exaggerated care. When they finally lay down, Thomas on his side of the bed, Grace on hers, a careful foot of space between them. The darkness felt both comfortable and charged. "Thomas." Grace's voice came soft through the dark. "Yeah." "Thank you for asking properly, for giving me a choice. Thank you for saying yes." Silence fell again, then so quietly he almost missed it. "Good night, husband. Good night, wife." And for the first time since Margaret died, Thomas fell asleep not to the sound of his own grief, but to the soft breathing of someone who'd chosen to be there, someone who'd chosen him. Winter arrived in earnest 2 weeks after the wedding, bringing with it snow that fell like a curtain between the ranch and the rest of the world. Thomas woke each morning to find Grace already up, the fire burning warm, coffee brewing on the stove. They'd fallen into a rhythm, tentative at first, but growing more natural with each passing day. Marriage, Thomas discovered, was both easier and harder than he'd expected. Easier because Grace asked for so little and gave so much. Harder because every moment of domestic peace reminded him of what he'd lost with Margaret, even as he built something new with Grace. They hadn't talked much about the intimacy of marriage. Each night they lay in bed with that careful space between them, both afraid to cross it for different reasons. Thomas because he wasn't ready to let go of Margaret's ghost. Grace because she feared being just a replacement, a substitute for what he truly wanted. But slowly, things were changing. Thomas found himself reaching for Grace's hand at the dinner table. Grace began humming while she cooked, the house filling with melodies that made it feel alive again. Emma thrived, growing plumper and more alert, her eyes following both of them with equal trust. It was on a Thursday morning, while Thomas was splitting wood behind the barn, that trouble arrived. 3 riders appeared through the falling snow, their horses dark against the white landscape. Thomas set down his axe and moved toward the house, instinct telling him this wasn't a social visit. Through the window, he saw Grace look up from her mending, her body tensing as she recognized danger. The lead rider was a man Thomas had never seen before, tall and broad, with a thick beard and eyes like chips of ice. The other 2 looked like hired muscle, their hands resting too casually near their gun belts. "Help you, gentlemen," Thomas called out, positioning himself between the riders and the house. The bearded man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That depends. You Thomas Brennan?" "I am. And you are?" "Name's Caleb Hartley." He let the name hang in the air, watching for Thomas's reaction. Grace's husband. The world seemed to tilt. Thomas kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced. "Grace told me her baby's father wasn't in the picture. Did she now?" Caleb swung down from his saddle, his movements deliberate and threatening. "Well, she always was good at telling stories. Truth is, we were married proper in Georgia 3 years back. Then she ran off, took my property with her." "What property? The child she was carrying?" "My son." Caleb's voice hardened. "Heard he died. Shame that. But I also heard my wife's shacked up here, playing house with another man's baby." "That true?" Thomas heard the door open behind him. "Don't," he said quietly without turning. But Grace came anyway, Emma bundled in her arms, her face pale but composed. "Hello, Caleb." "There she is." Caleb's smile widened. "Looking well, wife. Marriage to another man seems to agree with you." "We were never married," Grace said, her voice steady. "You told everyone we were, but we never stood before a preacher. You wanted the appearance of respectability without the commitment. Got a piece of paper says different." Caleb patted his coat. "Marriage certificate, signed and witnessed. Makes what you're doing here bigamy. That's a crime in case you forgot." Thomas felt cold spread through his chest. "Show me this paper." Caleb pulled out a folded document, yellowed and official-looking. Thomas took it, studying the signatures and dates. If it was a forgery, it was a good one. But something about it felt wrong, the ink too fresh, the paper too new despite its artificial aging. "Even if this is real," Thomas said slowly, "abandonment is grounds for annulment. Grace says you wanted nothing to do with the child, that you threw her out. I say she ran off with my money and my son." "My word against hers?" Caleb's expression turned ugly. "And we both know whose word a judge will believe. A respected landowner from a good family, or a woman who spread her legs before marriage and can't even keep her babies alive." Grace flinched as if struck. Thomas handed back the paper, his jaw tight with fury. "Get off my land! Not without my wife. She's not your wife." "She's mine. We were married legally 2 weeks ago. By what authority? Man can't marry another man's wife even if she lies about being available." Caleb looked past Thomas to Grace. "Come on, Grace. Time to stop playing pretend and come home. I'm not going anywhere with you. You don't have a choice. Law says a wife belongs to her husband. You're my property whether you like it or not." Thomas moved before he could think, his fist connecting with Caleb's jaw. The bigger man stumbled back but didn't fall. His two companions immediately drew their guns, but Caleb held up a hand. "Easy, boys. Man's just defending his honor. Can't fault him for that." He rubbed his jaw, spitting blood into the snow. "But that's assault, Brennan, in front of witnesses. Gives me even more reason to involve the law." "Then do it," Thomas growled. "Bring the sheriff out here. Let's see what he makes of your story." "Oh, I will. But I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you till tomorrow to think about this. Talk to your woman. Help her understand that she's got no choice here." He swung back into his saddle. "Tomorrow morning I come back with the sheriff. Grace leaves with me, or I press charges against you both. Assault, bigamy. I'll take this ranch, that baby, everything you got. Your choice." The three men rode off, their laughter carrying on the wind. Thomas stood frozen until they disappeared, then turned to find Grace trembling violently. Emma clutched against her chest. "Inside," he said gently. "Come on." In the house, Grace sank into the rocking chair, her breath coming in short gasps. Thomas knelt beside her, his hands on her knees. "Grace, look at me. Is it true? Were you married to him?" "I don't know." Her voice was barely a whisper. "He said we were. Made me sign papers. But there was never a ceremony, no preacher. I thought he was lying to keep control over me. What about the money he mentioned?" "I took $30 when I left. Money I'd saved from my wages. He's made it into hundreds in his story, I'm sure." Thomas's mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. If Caleb's marriage certificate was genuine, or even if it wasn't, but a judge believed it, Grace's marriage to Thomas would be invalid. She could be forced to return with Caleb, and if she refused, Thomas could lose everything, his ranch, his freedom, maybe even Emma, if they claimed he'd participated in bigamy. "We need help," Thomas said. "We need someone who knows the law." "Who? Your sister-in-law hates me. Most of the town thinks I'm a schemer anyway. They'll believe Caleb. Not everyone." Thomas stood, decision crystallizing. "The Cullivers. Pastor Gaines. And there's a lawyer in Missoula, man who handled my father's estate. He's honest, knows me. If we can get to him, there's no time. Caleb said tomorrow morning. Then we leave tonight. Take Emma, go to Missoula, file papers contesting whatever claim he's making. We fight this properly, through the law, and if the law sides with him." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then we run. Take Emma and go somewhere he'll never find us. Canada, maybe, California." Grace's eyes widened. "Thomas, you'd give up your ranch? Your family's legacy?" "In a heartbeat. If it's between this land and you and Emma, there's no choice." Something shifted in Grace's expression, wonder mixed with fear. "You do that for me?" "You're my wife." "Emma's my daughter. I protect what's mine." They spent the afternoon preparing. Thomas packed essentials into saddlebags. Money he'd been saving, documents, supplies for the journey. Grace bundled warm clothes for Emma and made food that would travel. Every few minutes, one of them would go to the window, checking the horizon for riders who might return early. As sunset approached, Thomas went to the barn to prepare the horses. He was cinching the saddle when he heard footsteps behind him. Grace stood in the doorway, Emma sleeping against her shoulder. "I've been thinking," she said. "What if I go with him? Just for a little while. Let him think he's won. Then when you've had time to talk to the lawyer to build a case—" "No!" Thomas's voice was sharp. "Absolutely not. You're not going anywhere near that man. But if it saves the ranch—" "Damn the ranch." He crossed to her, taking her face in his hands. "Grace, listen to me. I don't care about the land. I don't care about what people think or what Caleb threatens. I care about you and Emma being safe. That's all that matters." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "How can you say that? This place is your whole life." "It was. Before you. Before I understood that a place is just dirt and wood without people to make it home." His thumbs wiped away her tears. "You made this a home again. You and Emma. I'm not losing that. I'm not losing you." Grace leaned into him, careful not to crush Emma between them. They stood like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other. When they finally pulled apart, Something had shifted between them, the last wall of careful distance finally crumbling. "We should go before dark," Thomas said. "Wait." Grace set Emma in her basket and pulled off her wedding ring. For a terrifying moment, Thomas thought she was leaving it behind. But instead, she took his hand and pressed the ring into his palm, closing his fingers around it. "Keep this safe. When this is over, you can put it back on my finger properly. No fear, no running, just us choosing each other." Thomas pocketed the ring, then pulled his own off and handed it to her. "Same to you. Hold on to this. Reminds you, I'm coming back no matter what." They were loading the last of their supplies when a voice called from the darkness. "Running away, Thomas. Didn't take you for a coward." Thomas spun to find Caleb standing at the edge of the barn, his 2 men flanking him. Behind them in the shadows, Thomas counted at least 3 more figures. "Figured you might try something like this," Caleb continued, stepping into the lamplight. "So I came back early. With friends. Sheriff's on his way too. Should be here within the hour." "The sheriff knows what you're doing." "Sheriff knows I'm claiming what's rightfully mine. My wife and whatever property she stole." His eyes flicked to Emma. "That baby yours, Brennan? Or did Grace convince you it was while she warmed your bed?" "Don't!" Grace warned, her hand on Thomas's arm. But Thomas shook her off, his rage finally breaking free. "Emma is my daughter. Grace is my wife. And you're a liar and a coward who can't accept that she escaped you." Caleb's smile vanished. "Last chance, Brennan. Hand over Grace and maybe I don't press charges. Maybe you keep your ranch and your freedom. Maybe." Thomas looked at Grace, at the fear and determination warring in her face. He thought about running, about fighting, about all the ways this could end badly. Then he thought about Emma, sleeping peacefully in her basket, innocent of all the adult complications threatening to tear her world apart. He made his choice. "No," Thomas said simply. "You want her, you'll have to go through me. And even if you do, even if you take her by force, she'll never be yours. She chose me. She'll keep choosing me. Every day for the rest of her life, she'll be choosing to leave you." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. His face went red with fury. "Then you're both going to jail. And that baby, she'll go to an orphanage, or maybe I'll keep her. Raise her to know her father was a fool who threw everything away for a whore who wasn't worth it." Grace made a sound like she'd been stabbed. Thomas moved without thinking, lunging for Caleb, but the hired men grabbed him, holding him back. Caleb stepped close, his breath hot on Thomas's face. "Should have taken the deal, friend. Now you lose everything." Hoofbeats echoed in the darkness. The sheriff was arriving. Their window of escape had closed. Thomas looked at Grace over Caleb's shoulder and saw the same resignation in her eyes. They'd lost. For now. But as the sheriff's lantern bobbed into view, Thomas made a silent promise. This wasn't over. Whatever happened next, jail, charges, losing the ranch, he would find a way back to his family. He would protect what was his, even if it meant burning down the whole damn world to do it. Sheriff Wade Chambers was a lean man in his 50s, with a weathered face that had seen too many ugly situations to be surprised by much. He dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the scene. Thomas held by 2 men, Grace clutching Emma, Caleb standing like a conquering general. "Evening, Thomas," Wade said, his voice neutral. "Mr. Hartley here says we've got a situation." "We've got a liar on my property making threats," Thomas shot back. "That's the situation." Caleb stepped forward, pulling out his documents. "Sheriff, this woman is legally my wife. Has been for 3 years. She ran off, and now she's committed bigamy by marrying this man. I want her returned to me, and charges filed against both of them." Wade took the papers, studying them by lantern light. His expression gave nothing away. Finally, he looked at Grace. "Ma'am, what's your side of this?" Grace's voice shook but held steady. "Caleb Hartley is a liar. We were never married before a preacher or a judge. He told people we were, made me sign papers, but there was no legal ceremony. He wanted control without commitment. You signed papers, though. I was 18, scared, and he said it was just for show. I didn't know better. And the child he mentioned? Grace's arms tightened around Emma. My son. He died 3 weeks after he was born. Caleb never wanted him. Called him a mistake. I left because I couldn't stay in a place where my baby's death was treated as a convenience. Caleb's face twisted. She's lying. She stole money and ran $30 of my own wages, Grace interrupted. Money I earned cooking and cleaning in his house while he told everyone I was his wife, but wouldn't make it legal, because then I might have rights. Wade held up a hand for silence. He turned to Caleb. This marriage certificate. Where was the ceremony performed? Small church outside Augusta. Preacher named Morrison. You got witnesses who were there? Caleb hesitated for just a moment. They've moved on. But the paper's legal. Paper means nothing without witnesses or a preacher to verify. Wade's voice had gone hard. I've seen my share of forged documents, Mr. Hartley. This feels like one of them. You calling me a liar? I'm saying I'd need more than this to arrest anyone for bigamy. He handed the papers back. And even if it was real, a woman can leave a man who's cruel. Law might not like it, but it understands it. I want my property back. The money she stole, the $30 isn't worth the ride from Georgia. Mr. Hartley, so either you're here for spite, or there's something else you want. The men holding Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Something in Wade's tone suggested he'd already made up his mind about who was telling the truth. Caleb's jaw clenched. She's my wife. That's all that matters. Except she's also married to Thomas Brennan with witnesses and a real preacher to verify it. So unless you can prove your claim is legitimate, and I mean prove, not just wave papers around, I'd say your trip was wasted. Then I'll go to a judge. Get a real ruling, you do that. But until then, Grace Brennan stays where she is, with her legal husband. Wade turned to Thomas. You boys let him go now. The hired men released Thomas, who immediately went to Grace's side. Wade watched the exchange, then looked back at Caleb with barely concealed disgust. Might want to think about heading home, Mr. Hartley. Weather's turning bad, and you've got a long ride ahead. Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen on the road. It was a dismissal and a warning. Caleb heard both. His face went red, but he wasn't stupid enough to argue with an armed sheriff. He mounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. This isn't over, he said to Grace. You think you can just walk away from me? Start over like I never existed? That's exactly what I did, Grace replied, her voice stronger now. And I'll keep doing it every day for the rest of my life. Caleb's expression promised retribution. But he wheeled his horse around and rode into the darkness, his men following. The sound of hooves faded until only silence remained. Wade turned to Thomas and Grace, his stern expression softening slightly. You two all right? We are now, Thomas said. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet. That marriage certificate, fake or not, could still cause trouble if he pushes it. You'll want to get a lawyer, build a proper case. Already planning on it. Wade nodded, then looked at Grace. Ma'am, I need to ask. Did that man ever hurt you? Physically, I mean. Grace's silence was answer enough. Wade's jaw tightened. Right, well, if he comes back around, you let me know immediately. And Thomas, don't do anything stupid. I know what you're thinking, but taking the law into your own hands will only make things worse. I understand. After Wade left, Thomas and Grace stood in the barn, Emma between them, the adrenaline slowly draining away. Thomas's hands were shaking. Grace's face was pale. Without a word, they moved together, Thomas wrapping his arms around both her and Emma, holding them close. I thought I'd lost you, he whispered into her hair. You almost did. Grace pulled back to look at him. Thomas, I'm so sorry. I brought this to your door. I should have known Caleb wouldn't let go. Stop, he cupped her face. You didn't bring anything but life to this place. Caleb's poison is his own. You're not responsible for his cruelty, but what if he does go to a judge? What if, then we'll fight it together, and if we lose, we run. I meant what I said, Grace. This ranch means nothing without you and Emma. Tears spilled down her cheeks. How did I get so lucky? After everything, to find you. I'm the lucky one. Thomas kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, tasting salt. You saved my life. Let me save yours. They went back to the house and spent the next hour securing it, checking locks, making sure everything was in order. Emma, oblivious to the crisis, nursed and fell asleep with the easy peace of the innocent. When she was settled, Thomas built up the fire, while Grace made tea neither of them would drink. I don't think I can sleep, Grace admitted. Neither can I. Thomas sat beside her on the sofa they'd pulled close to the fire. Want to talk? Or just sit? Talk, tell me something good. Something that has nothing to do with Caleb or fear or running, Thomas thought for a moment. When I was a boy, maybe 7 or 8, my father took me up into the mountains. Said every Brennan man needed to see the ranch from above, to understand how small we are and how big the world is. He smiled at the memory. We camped for 3 days, fished in streams so cold your hands went numb, saw elk and eagles. On the last night he told me the land wasn't ours, we were just caretakers. Our job was to leave it better than we found it. That's beautiful. I forgot it for a while. After Margaret died, I just wanted to hold on to everything, keep it exactly as it was. Like if I changed anything, I'd lose her completely. He took Grace's hand. But you reminded me what my father meant. It's not about the land. It's about what you build on it. Who you share it with. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. I want to build something lasting here. With you, a family. A real one. We already have. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Gradually, exhaustion won out over anxiety. Grace's breathing evened, her body growing heavy against his. Thomas shifted carefully, lifting her in his arms and carrying her to their bedroom. She barely stirred as he laid her down and pulled blankets over her. He checked on Emma one more time, sleeping peacefully, her small chest rising and falling, then returned to the bedroom. He lay down beside Grace, and for the first time since their wedding, there was no careful space between them. Grace, still half asleep, curled into his side. Thomas wrapped an arm around her and they slept. Morning came with weak winter sunlight and the smell of snow. Thomas woke to find Grace already up, but she'd left a note on the pillow, making breakfast. Don't worry. He found her in the kitchen, Emma in her basket nearby, a real meal taking shape on the stove. Eggs, bacon, bread toasting. The domesticity of it, after the terror of last night, felt surreal. Thought we could use a proper breakfast, Grace said, looking over her shoulder. We're going to Missoula today, right? To see that lawyer? First thing. I'll hitch the wagon after we eat. They were finishing breakfast when hoofbeats approached again. Thomas tensed, hand moving toward his rifle. But it was James Culliver who appeared, followed by Pastor Gaines, and behind them, a woman Thomas recognized as Martha Henderson, the town clerk. Morning, James called out. Mind if we come in? Inside, crowded around the table, the visitors explained. Sarah Culliver had spent yesterday evening asking questions around town. Martha Henderson had confirmed what they suspected. No marriage record existed for Caleb Hartley and Grace in any county in Georgia or Montana. I wired my cousin in Augusta, Martha said. The church Caleb mentioned? Burned down 5 years ago. The preacher Morrison died in the fire. No record survived. Even if there was a ceremony, there'd be no way to prove it now. And I took the liberty of contacting a judge I know in Helena. Pastor Gaines added. Explained the situation. He said that without verifiable records or living witnesses, no court would honor Caleb's claim, especially not over a legitimate witnessed marriage like yours. Thomas felt the weight he'd been carrying lift slightly. So Grace is safe. Legally. Yes, but Caleb sounds like the type who won't let this go easy, James warned. You'll want to be careful. Men like that losing in court won't stop him. It'll just make him vindictive. Then we'll be ready, Thomas said. After the visitors left, Thomas and Grace stood on the porch, watching them disappear down the road. The sun had broken through the clouds, turning the snow-covered valley into something beautiful and almost hopeful. "It's really over?" Grace asked. "The legal part, maybe. But James is right. Caleb might try something else. Then we face it together." Grace turned to him, and Thomas saw something new in her expression. Not just relief or gratitude, but something deeper. Something that looked like love beginning to take root. "Grace, I need to tell you something." Thomas pulled her ring from his pocket, the one she'd given him last night. "When I put this on your finger the first time, I did it out of duty, responsibility, but now—" He slipped it back onto her hand. "Now I'm doing it because I choose you. Not because Emma needs you, though she does. Not because it's practical, though it is. But because when I think about my future, you're in it, always." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She pulled out his ring and took his hand. "When I said yes to you, I thought I was choosing safety. A place to heal. But somewhere along the way, I started choosing you. The man who knelt in the snow to propose properly. Who was willing to give up everything to protect us. Who makes me believe that broken things can be made whole again." She slid the ring onto his finger. "I love you, Thomas Brennan. Not the ghost of who you were with Margaret, but who you are now. Who we're becoming together." "I love you too," Thomas said, and realized it was true. Not the same love he'd had for Margaret. That would always be its own thing, precious and untouchable. But this was real too, built on shared grief and hard choices, and the decision to keep choosing each other every day. They kissed, and it was different from their wedding kiss. This one held promise and passion and the knowledge that they'd face darkness and come through together. Emma's cry interrupted them. They broke apart laughing, and Grace went to tend to their daughter. Thomas watched her go. This woman who'd walked into his life during a storm and somehow become his future. The ranch still needed work. Winter would be hard. Caleb might return. There would be challenges and fears and moments of doubt, but for the first time since Margaret died, Thomas looked at his life and saw not what he'd lost, but what he'd found. Not the past he mourned, but the future he was building. That afternoon, as snow began to fall again, Thomas stood in the barn doorway watching Grace play with Emma in the yard. She was showing the baby the snowflakes, laughing as Emma tried to catch them with her tiny hands. The sound of that laughter carried on the wind, warm despite the cold. Thomas thought about his father's words, about being caretakers, about leaving things better than you found them. He looked at the ranch, at the woman and child who'd made it home again, and understood finally what that meant. It wasn't about preserving what was. It was about having the courage to build what could be. Grace looked up and caught him watching. She smiled, that smile that had started tentative and careful, but now came easy and bright. She waved, and Emma waved too, a clumsy baby gesture that made Thomas's chest tight with love. He waved back, then went to join his family in the snow. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. And that, Thomas knew, was more than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.